Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Connecticut's Old State House. I'm Sally Whipple. I'm the Executive Director here, and we're very pleased to have you here for one of our monthly Conversations at Noon programs. It's always a pleasure to have you here, and today we're happy to also have our farmers market here for the first time this summer, and we hope you'll take advantage of that. We're starting out. Thank you. We've got a few farmers out there in Chet's Italian Ice, so hope you get to do some shopping. But before we get to that, we let you go outside to the farmers market, I would just like to say that as you came up to the building, you probably noticed that it is surrounded by scaffolding. We have a lot of scaffolding around this building, which is a wonderful thing and a terrible thing. It doesn't look so good if you're trying to take pictures, if you're a tourist on vacation, or if you're doing something for a historic preservation book, but it means that we're getting a new roof, and that is a terrific thing. It is wonderful when a building like this gets a facelift, and this one has had many facelifts over the years. Of course, it's also been threatened with destruction many times over the years, and we're here in the Old State House, in the room of the Amistad trials, in a very important, iconic building for Connecticut, because long ago, people had a vision for what an old building could mean to the future. And that's why we're in the Old State House today. And we owe a lot to people long ago who had this kind of vision for us today. And we also owe our thanks to people like Helen Higgins, who for many years have fought strategically and energetically and smartly for our right to learn from our past and to be surrounded by our past. Helen has done so much for the history community, for preservation, for the people of Connecticut. It is hard to convey what she has done to us, but I think you can look all around Connecticut and get an idea of what Helen has meant to this state. I would be remiss if I did not say that Helen also means a lot to me personally. When I first got out of graduate school and got my first real, i.e. non-tour guide job in a museum, I was asked to be on the Connecticut League of History Organizations board, and I had no idea what I was doing. But Helen Higgins was the chair of that board. And from Helen, by watching her, by listening to her, by paying attention to what she said and how she behaved, I learned a lot about leadership, about the value of the history community in Connecticut, about strategic thinking, and about how to listen. I learned a great deal from Helen, and I will be forever indebted to her whenever I think about things that I've been able to accomplish in the history field, and whenever I look around me and see this beautiful building and other buildings like it, because Helen has done so much for our cultural landscape. So with those words, I would just like to thank Helen and turn this over to Diane Smith, who is going to have a conversation with Helen today, and I'm sure we will all learn so much from it. And I'm glad that you're all here to share this with us.
Thank you, Sally. You practically have me in tears. I don't know about you, Helen, but she has me all choked up now, so hopefully we'll be able to
that
do
was really
this.
extraordinary, Sally, I have to say.
Well, I want to open the program, or at least this portion of it, by quoting Elizabeth Norman, who is the publisher of this wonderful magazine, Connecticut Explored, and we do have some copies of it in the back if you'd like to grab one on your way out, although I hope you all subscribe. This is what Elizabeth wrote in this summer's edition of the magazine, this one here. She wrote, "Is historic preservation only about saving old buildings from demolition? Unless you're deeply involved in the field, you might not know that current thinking looks at the bigger picture and appreciates that individual buildings are components of something larger, such as a neighborhood or community that deserves preserving too. Those of us outside the field of preservation might think that a building worth saving has to be connected with someone famous or important. But preservationists are increasingly appreciating that workaday buildings, such as factory, houser working, and barns, are also important to preserving our history and our culture." Well, our guest today has really been at the forefront of that thinking. Helen Higgins has been the executive director of the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation, a statutory partner of the Office of Culture and Tourism, the Department of Economic and Community Development. She's been in that position since 1997, and all those names have changed, but not your mission, Helen. As an ex officio member of the Culture and Tourism's Advisory Council, Helen has been actively involved in the evolution of the agency through participation in strategic planning sessions, subcommittees, subcommittees and as a close working partner with the State Historic Preservation Office. Helen served on the board, as Sally mentioned, of the Connecticut League of History Organizations and was the head of it, was the chair of the Connecticut Humanities Council for a number of years. As director of the Connecticut Trust, Helen developed a signature field program and a historic preservation planning grant program. Helen also initiated a project called Historic Barns of Connecticut, which has now been nationally recognized. Under her leadership, the Trust has been busy surveying and documenting everything from barns to industrial sites. And much of what we treasure in the historic landscape of Connecticut has been saved thanks to the hard work and the leadership of Helen Higgins, who is retiring July 1st as Executive Director of the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation. We're glad that you were able to spare a day before your retirement to be here with us. So today we want to hear a little bit about some of the important work that has been accomplished in the years that she's been at the helm of that organization, and to talk a little bit about the challenges that lie ahead. So please join me in welcoming Helen Higgins.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you. I wouldn't be here today without. Can we go to the staff?
Here we are.
There. That's what we're all about. These people, and they're one. Raise your hand, Aaron, and I'll get to you. Jane is here. Chris Wiegren, our deputy director, and the new executive director, Daniel McKay, is sitting right there.
Wonderful.
From New York State. So I want to acknowledge that what I am is from that.
Terrific.
Thanks.
Terrific. Well, let's start a little bit, and we do have some images that we're going to share with you. And I also want to encourage you to ask questions. If you'd like, just raise your hand and we'll get to you with a microphone, because we are recording this program for CTN, so we do need you to speak into the microphone. So raise your hand at any point if you have something you want to comment or ask Helen. So Helen, let's talk about some of the biggest challenges in Connecticut over the last 20 years. At one point, preservation was seen as an obstacle to redevelopment and economic vitality. I think you've proven that that's not true. Let's talk about it a little bit.
Well, I mean, that is, as Elizabeth pointed out, I mean, that is really what's been happening nationally with historic preservation, but certainly in this state, is we have been able to make some real progress with state agencies and with municipalities, municipal leaders, to indicate that redevelopment of downtowns, redevelopment of neighborhoods is a positive for the people who live there, and it's also a positive for, it's an incentive to move to places in Connecticut. I think that, when I came to the Trust, I think the solution for our cities was still the big stadium kind of solution or the big downtown mall, and that really has changed. And part of it is, people speak with their feet. And a lot of the millennials, as we call them, and older, and the retirees, a lot of people began to see that they wanted to be able to walk to get their cup of coffee. And that's part of the dynamic of change here. I was fascinated today to hear an ad on the radio for Zillow, which you all know is the real estate firm. Right. And they said, and you could find this nice little bungalow and walk to get your coffee. And I thought, man, that is a huge change. So there are a lot of things that kind of came up over the time that I've been at the Trust that have contributed to a new approach. And not least of which has been at the Department of Economic and Community Development. I'd like to mention Kip Bergstrom, who was their deputy commissioner, who really put the concept of place and historic preservation out there at the state level. And we are now, he's not there anymore, but we are now moving forward on those ideas, and those things are important.
Ellen, I want to talk a little bit more a little later about where people want to live, but I also want to talk about some of the kinds of places that are being saved, because I think my initial idea when I first came to Connecticut a number of years ago about historic preservation were all of those iconic old homes that belonged to someone who was significant in history. And we have some of those that we're going to share in images. But that's not necessarily the thrust of what's going on anymore.
No, it's not at all. There has been, and actually I think you can look in Hartford in the 80s, when the redevelopment of Frog Hollow, there's sort of people began to want to live in the cities, and then it became, looking at neighborhoods, and again, about Hartford Asylum Hill, where Nina has been so successful as a nonprofit developer, taking just a vernacular house and turning it into, a new home ownership opportunity. So historic preservation kind of changed from just saving one place into looking at more broadly, and it's a lot of different factors that came into play there, but. I mentioned the 80s. I mean, everything in historic preservation takes forever. So, I mean, we say, well, has there been a lot of change since 1997? Well, I went through all our newsletters that are called Connecticut Preservation News, and, well, early on, we were identifying industrial sites as endangered. And we were, identifying, particularly Colt as endangered. And now, of course, that is a success to this level. It hasn't gone quite up to the next level yet, which it will soon. But some of the places that we had as endangered, I'd like to mention 410 Asylum, which is, was it a piano showroom and a commercial building, and not related to anybody, but around the Bushnell Park. And a developer was going to take it down. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. And the state took them to court over it. And now it's been redeveloped as a fabulous apartments for supportive housing and affordable housing. And it's just an example of just doing historic preservation where it's not George Washington slept here.
Right, right. Well,
to
let's
your
talk
point.
a little bit about the industrial sites, because that is very interesting to me. I live in Norwalk, and so I spent a lot of time in South Norwalk, and I've seen an area that was what a lot of people years ago when I first moved to Norwalk was a formerly industrial site, and people said, get rid of those old buildings, let's take those down. And now, rather than getting rid of them, they've not only restored them, they've repurposed them,
right.
And they've now built buildings that look like the old ones to kind of match it, which I think is sort of an interesting idea.
Oh dear. Well, we sort of like that, I mean, nothing about West Hartford here, but Sono was really one of the first places to attract the idea of you could have artists and sort of a vibrant, kind of hip downtown. And another place that's been like that, and I'll get to your point in a second, is New London, which is really hip. Really cool,
It's
really
the Brooklyn-
edgy.
it's sort of the Brooklyn of Connecticut.
Right, and you guys all need to go there.
Yeah.
I mean, we just did a pub crawl there, and it was fantastic. But what was your question again? I'm sorry.
I was asking about saving industrial sites, because at one
right.
time people said, oh, those are eyesores, get rid of those old buildings.
Well, yes, and as Chris Wiegren, our deputy director, has said, it's very hard to get passionate about an ugly place. So, over time, our state has really been behind in identifying these places as places for repurposing. I like that. And recently, the state, DECD, the Department of Economic Community Development, with the governor's incentive, the governor's initiative, has developed a brownfields granting program, which, frankly, is getting rid of brownfields and industrial sites is really the impediment to repurposing.
Helen, let's explain for people that aren't familiar with the term and don't know what the impediment is. Let's talk a little bit about what we mean by brownfields and what the initiative calls for.
Well, it's contamination. All factories were using solvents or whatever that, contaminated the property, and the contamination is below ground, it's in the walls, it's all around. And so if you're a developer and you go in and you want to redevelop a property that has contamination, the first thing you have to face is millions of dollars to abate, get rid of, mitigate, whatever the different ways are, that kind of contamination. And this keeps developers out of Connecticut. So the state has come in, and there's been an advocacy for a number of years, but now they've put some real money on the table, and don't ask me the exact amount, but it was $10 million at one point, and I'm not sure where it is now. But to help municipalities, this is money to municipalities, clean up a site in order to bring a developer in. And this is really going to smooth the way for us. And then in addition, while the state DECT is doing that, the State Historic Preservation Office has funded us to do a comprehensive inventory of all our existing industrial sites. And the point for that, I mean, they're, for planning purposes, but also a developer calls us and says, I'm really interested in Bristol. And we can pull out and say, well, here's some places that, you could be redeveloped and this could be that, whatever. So the inventory now has about 1,000 identified industrial sites on it.
What are some of the more recognizable ones that people might know of or pass by and see?
Well, Culp would have been one, but,
right.
Capewell, for instance, over here on Charter Oak and Swift Factory in the North End. In Cheshire, we do have someone here from Cheshire, the Ball and Socket Factory, what was that? What did they make there? Buttons? No, yes. Buttons. It was a button factory, but it's contaminated.
Right.
And in New Haven, there's right on the river, there's Bigelow Boiler Factory and with another one, and they're pretty much a mess, and they've had fires, but you know what? The city of New Haven wants to redevelop them. And Yale in Town and Stamford has been redeveloped. And then there are mills, like if you go into Vernon, there are a lot of mills that are currently being redeveloped, but we identified them in like 2004, I think, in our newsletter as, endangered. So it's taken a long time to move that along.
So Helen, you mentioned that it's sometimes hard to get people excited about an ugly building. So how do you go about getting them excited about an ugly building? Here's an industrial site.
How nice it can look.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah.
That's an ugly building. So
look at that.
There you go.
Yeah.
So actually part of our Making Places, as it's called, project, we have a half-hour, 45-minute PowerPoint called Got Mill, where we do a lot of this before and after to try to get people excited that, things can look really cool. But let me also say there's not every mill or old industrial building would aspire to look like this. There certainly is a movement to take some of these buildings and stabilize them and allow for a lesser use, whether it's a car, cars could park there, or maybe bring them up just one more level and have them be an open air a market or something. And then, of course, a higher level would be an arts center and so on. But maybe not cleaning everything up and taking down, leaving it a little bit raw inside. And I think we found even nationally, the National Trust for Historic Preservation has found that young people, the people like to rent that raw space. All those exposed walls that you see, that's kind of the raw space. So it's not all going to be beautiful.
Yeah. Interesting, though. I think that one of the things that
oh my God,
you and I...
that's Plume and Atwood in Thomaston. Half of that is gone now.
Oh my.
We didn't get there fast enough.
Collapse there?
Yeah. Well, and then they just took it down. So that's it, down. It's gone. There's a before and after.
Yeah. Well, when you say
not all is good and pretty here.
You say we didn't get there fast enough. How is it that the organization is able to move and get places? How much does that involve taking legal action sometimes and other sorts of remedies in order to prevent that from happening?
We can't prevent that from happening. But what we do try to do, kind of on another initiative, is we try to get into municipalities and work with municipal leaders and community members on identifying underutilized historic sites. That's called our Vibrant Communities Initiative. And that would be how, if we had been in Thomaston, we would have worked more closely on that. And that's funded also by the State Historic Preservation Office. It's a very, very powerful tool to bring to the attention of municipal leaders, who I think are key in change in their communities. They're key to it. To bring to their attention that, going back to your first point, that if you invest in these sites you will see an economic return on that investment. It will contribute to the vitality of your community.
Helen, you and I discussed this prior to today's conversation, and you told me about preservation being environmentally friendly development. And I mentioned that to a few people, and they said, but aren't the newer, greener buildings better? So explain that.
Well, fortunately, I asked this question in the car coming up. The greenest building is the one that's already been built. And that's been a mantra of the Connecticut Trust for 35 years. And so that if you don't take down a building, in order to build a new building, most of the time you're taking down a building, which contributes to all kinds of, carbon spewing, and creates, goes into the pile of garbage and so on. Whereas if you keep your building and repair it or slightly repurpose it, you are saving the environment from all of that sort of contamination, to say it quickly. And the other thing that you're doing, and this Chris explained to me in the car, is that you're maintaining a building that has already shown its ability to be sustainable over time, and it will be sustainable over time again. The newer buildings are unproven on that regard, and often new materials, and this is why in historic preservation we don't like a lot of new vinyl and replacement materials, because they have not been tested over time to actually last. And I think if you look at some of the modernist houses that were built in the 60s and 70s, the biggest deterioration is in their building materials.
I was just going to ask you about what about saving the mid-century moderns, because a number of those, what at the time were extremely advanced materials and advanced techniques that were used, turned out to be not so sustainable, turned out to have leaky roofs and leaky windows and all that.
Flat roofs and so on. No, I mean, it's a big problem. I think, to be able to repair a modernist house by a significant enough architect, you have to have very deep private pockets. Mm-hmm. It is not something that is appealing to the nonprofit and municipal world. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Although there are bigger structures beyond houses that have been saved successfully, and then some that are still really endangered. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about cities again, because you were mentioning how we've moved away a bit from the big save approaches, the big mall developments and all that. But here we are sitting in Hartford where a stadium is about to be built just a few blocks from where we are. Tell me, my question I guess is, with all the preservation that has already happened in Hartford and all the preservation that is still in the planning stages, how does a city go about merging a big development like that with what we already have?
Well, I'm going to ask Frank Hageman, perhaps he could resolve this problem, but the Hartford Preservation Alliance. But, I think new and old can coexist. I mean, I think that you can't be just, don't change anything. So, I can't really comment on the stadium, but I know it was successful in New Britain. I mean, I hope that around that neighborhood that they can, keep some of that community together, and that it doesn't, I hope it doesn't become cars coming in, cars going out. I think the people of Hartford, the citizens of Hartford, don't want that to happen. They want it to be integral to, to their neighborhoods. Hartford is, I think Hartford's a very exciting place right now with these different neighborhood developments that are going on, and just being, right down here. Now, I know Front Street is new, but just the way all of this connects, you can walk everywhere. And I should point out that there is a new flyer on the official info guide map to Hartford's historical assets, which is over there, that you might want to take a look at, because Hartford has so much history in it. So sort of part of your question is there's already a lot of, whether it's a Hartford Preservation Alliance or Hartford history, people just really coming forward to say, we are going to protect this place. And Hartford, almost more than any other city in the state has a very strong preservation and history component for advocacy.
Let's talk about a couple of the other cities that have had some success with that. What about a place like Torrington?
Well, Torrington, how many years ago they were going to tear down a bunch of National Register of Historic Places buildings in order to build an outdoor mall. Oh, what a nice idea. JCPenney here, and just take those buildings down. And we were able, with a little bit of grant money and help from the National Trust, to develop an alternate plan, right? But then, as with so many of these cities, that these what I call the second-tier cities are trying to reinvent themselves, and they want to reinvent themselves fast and big and whatever, it all implodes. And even better than Torrington, which now, its downtown is fantastic with the Warner Theater and good restaurants. It's fantastic. And Ski's Diner is going to be back. And
thank goodness.
Yeah, I know.
That was a preservation project.
That was a real preservation project.
Had to happen.
But Derby is sort of our poster child for what goes wrong with these redevelopment plans. Derby has this kind of winding or curved Main Street, and it was, just sort of in late 19th century and semi-industrial kind of looking, but really a wonderful looking downtown. And some developer sold them a bill of goods, we're going to build, this big housing and all this other stuff. And so take all those buildings down on that side of the street. And in those days, we had a circuit rider, our field worker, who just got passionate about this. She'd go to the mayor's office and, and fight with him about this. The whole street came down. And guess who didn't come? The developer.
Never came.
So if you go to Derby today, you will see one half of that downtown is missing, and it's never come back. So that, that kind of approach, Torrington almost got there. And fortunately, it hasn't. And over time, it has evolved into a really terrific downtown. And I had this quote that from Donovan Ripkema, who's sort of the guru of demonstrating the economic value of historic preservation. And he says that, which page is it on here? Did I quote it? The three biggest mistakes, here he goes. The three biggest mistakes preservationists make are, and I would say this for municipal leaders too, we have to do it now, we have to do it all, and we have to do it in this preconceived way. And that would be the Torrington or whatever. And I think that one of the things that we've learned at the Trust over time is, and this is because historic preservation takes so long, but things evolve, things change, and they sort of build on, and new ideas come to play with the old ideas, and ultimately you get a good, you kind of get a good result. And I think that kind of evolution, it's organic, it's happening in Connecticut. What we do at the Trust and with the State Historic Preservation Offices, we try to stimulate that, but we can't make it happen.
And Helen, talking about evolving, I think about so many of the projects that happen in cities like Hartford, like New Haven and other places when there was a lot of big redevelopment money available in the 60s.
Right.
And so what happened? They took down neighborhoods, which are the places that people now would like to live in.
Right.
So we've gone full circle with that. So now we've lost the neighborhoods here, we've lost those neighborhoods in New Haven. We're trying to recreate those. Is that still possible to do in an authentic way?
Yeah, I mean, in Hartford, absolutely. The Farmington Avenue neighborhood is an example of that, where, there's, along the Nook Farm area and then further towards Asylum Hill. And also, there are a lot of neighborhoods in Hartford, as there are in New Haven, that are very appealing to people. And I just wish that more people would look at New London, because in downtown New London, there are some incredibly affordable historic houses that are, fantastic. The beautiful light in New London, I love. Norwich is another, has anybody been to Norwich? I mean, that is a place of beauty. It has the most magnificent architecture. It has one of the most outstanding city halls you'll ever see. And it also has, do you have the Warregan Hotel on here? Yeah, it also has one of our major successes, and that is the restoration of the Warregan Hotel, which was going to come down. When I visited the Warregan Hotel, when I visited that, that's an after. The birds were flying inside. It was really, you had to wear a hard hat, and the city was saying, oh, this is a public, safety hazard. It's got to come down, and so we fought that. And we found a developer who's doing, the same guy who's doing 777 Main, Bruce Becker. He redeveloped this. And it's an astonishing result because it then was a catalyst for more redevelopment in that downtown. But the properties around downtown, the houses, it's a beautiful city, and it deserves more.
Bill, could you back up to that Norwalk property? There was a house. Okay, now I passed this 2 or 3 times a week for years and years and years, and it started getting more and more and more decrepit, and I thought, what is going to happen here? Tell us a little bit about the struggle to save this place and why it was worth saving.
Well, I can't remember the whole history of the Grumman family. You probably know better than I, but it was an important house in Norwalk over the years, and then it became part of the Norwalk Inn, and I can't remember the ins and outs. Anyway, it was let to deteriorate, and the Norwalk Preservation Trust stepped up to the plate and took the owner with the state of Connecticut, the help from the State Historic Preservation Office, they took the owner of this property to court to stop this demolition. And this court case took many years. And during those many years of being in and out of court, this deterioration happened. How did it happen? Were there vandals? Were there, nobody really knew. But the bottom line is, and can you flip? That is what happened. And this case was resolved by 2 legislative leaders. They brought the warring parties, and let me tell you, they were warring, the inn owner and the preservation people. This was Senator Bob Duff, who is now our majority leader, and Representative Larry Cafaro, who's now out of, but those 2 brought people to the table and sat them down and said, look, can't we resolve this? And the owner agreed because he could then get more rooms in his inn in the back. It's always a bottom line issue. It's always a bottom line, it always is. So
I just remember driving past it so many times and thinking it's going to cave in on itself before it can be saved. I really was concerned.
It's amazing.
Does anyone have questions, by the way, or comments to make to Helen? We do have that opportunity. If anybody'd like to be part of the conversation, I encourage you to raise your hand. And okay, let's bring the microphone over here.
Oh, Donald, no, you.
Helen, you've mainly articulated a kind of bricks and mortar approach to historic preservation. I wonder what the role of historical expertise is, in looking at a particular project or a plan for a city, whatever.
Essential, Don. I mean, we can't do our work without understanding what it is we're working with, and that is the role of the historian. And so most of the work that might occur on a historic building, we generally start with a nomination of the building to the state or national register, and that sort of gets that historic piece to it. The people who do that, the Betsy's and so on, are the historic consultants. So there's a big role. Leah Glazer's over here, her students at Central Connecticut get involved in that. So there's a big role for the public historian.
We talked just a tiny bit, we sort of glanced on the idea of the house museums that populate the state. I like to think I've been to many of them. Sherry Hack is here, and Connecticut Landmarks has saved a number of those, but it takes so much work, not just to restore the building, but then to keep it as a viable property and a viable place that attracts people.
Yes.
I mean, it's not just a case of hang out the sign and people will come, right?
There are minds in this room better than mine who can address this issue. This is a national issue, our house museums, but it's particularly concentrated in the Northeast, where this is where the movement started. Well, it started with the Washington, Mount Vernon, thank you. It started there, women saving Mount Vernon, but it certainly in Connecticut has its antecedents to the the late 19th century in Guilford, where I'm from, so I sort of know this. But in the early 20th century, more Guilford, and then the Daughters of the American Revolution, and the Ellsworth House, and other places. And so over time, over the 20th century, preservation became sort of directly connected to the idea of saving a particular house that was iconic, generally. Right. But the answer to what to do with it was always to turn it into a museum. And that answer has changed. Mm-hmm. That's been, so yes, there will still be a lot of house museums, and there's still a struggle, but you need creative people like Sherry Hack, to come in and think of new ways to use them, whether it's farmers market. Sally's doing it here. Mm-hmm. The whole idea of bringing people to your site, not just to see the house, but to use it in different ways.
I think of some of the sites that have been preserved and are now used as facilities for parties and for weddings and places. And that's their primary, in many cases, that's their primary use. I'm thinking about the, is it the Longworth in Middletown? That
the Wadsworth.
Wadsworth estate,
Yeah, well, actually, there's a little bit of a fault line, I think, with using your historic venue so much for a non-mission directed, so you get into an unrelated business tax deal. Mm-hmm. But I think that many places, like the barn at Webdean Stevens is pretty much a wedding venue, and I think they separate it from the rest of their operation there. So,
well, I was just about to ask you about barns, and please, raise your hands if you have comments. I'll get to you in just a second, but let me ask you this. Part of the thing that I think many of us love about Connecticut, with maybe not even being really conscious of it, is the fact that you can drive outside the city and just in a few minutes, you're in an area that has farms and barns, and all of that is really important to the character. And so a number of years ago, I remember when you started this initiative about saving the barns. So since then, you found how many of them roughly across the state?
8,400 on our database.
Now,
and that's not every barn. There are some towns that we really didn't fully, and we had community members doing a lot of that inventory. Mm-hmm. So those are, and then we created 2,000 historic resource inventories on barns, which means that at least 2,000 of our barns have a level of documentation beyond just there it is. And then we nominated 200 of these successfully of barns to the State Register of Historic Places. And that is the research that then, was a little deeper. And all of this is on our ConnecticutBarns.org website. And we're still adding, mm-hmm. To it. And, barns, they're tough because repurposing them, often you run into zoning problems and so on. But some of them, can be on the big farms. I'm thinking of in Morris, Ben Piletsky's big farm up in Morris. I can't think of the name of it, but he's got a whole huge complex of barns, which now he's turning into an event venue. Mm-hmm. So he has a very creative entrepreneurial approach to how to use the barns because he's really not going to use them for farming.
Right.
There's this really sad situation on Route 80 in North Branford, which is the Duty homestead, and these fantastic outbuildings. And this one part of the barn is just, every day I go past it, it's just falling further and further in. And I know the owner would like to shore it up, which is, I think the Warregan was easier than that's going to be, but shore it up and then open it as a farm, like an active, kids can come and play with the animals sort of thing. But many of our iconic barns will be gone, in the next 50 years.
And Helen, I think, part of it you pointed out is that these are on private property. The homeowners did not necessarily purchase the property because the barn was part of it. And now you're talking about putting what might be a lot of money into preserving a building that they're probably not using. There are a lot of complicated issues with those structures.
Absolutely. That nails it because people, there's a house near where I am that has a complex of barns and it's not selling. Mm-hmm. Because the barns need work. Yeah. And, it's tough. I think I kind of compare in my head the difference industrial places to barns. Industrial places, manufacturing began to leave the state after World War II, and even before. But those buildings really can be repurposed because they're not privately owned. Maybe that's your key. And the barns that are just part of the backyard, they're very difficult. And if zoning doesn't allow you to have an accessory apartment, I mean, that's one of the standard things to do, and a lot of towns don't allow that. We gave out barn grants with private money a number of years ago, just for a couple of years. I mean, we just had hundreds of applicants, I mean, just anything. Give us $5,000 to fix the sill. One of the things I will say about barns, and I say this about any building, is that if you stabilize them, they will last. So if you can put a roof on and no water comes in, or if you can fix up your sills so that it doesn't collapse in itself, you will be able to keep that structure, and that is a minimal investment. So maybe one answer to the homeowners is, which is the answer we were giving years ago, was you can keep that. You don't have to pretty it up. We
had a question over here, a couple of questions, so let's bring the microphone over. Well, 1 minute? I promised him I would go to him next, but all right, Kay, go ahead.
I just want to say thank you to Helen. My name is Kay Greaser. I live in Barkhamsted. Although I come to Hartford all the time, you probably recognize the name. My husband and I are the living proof of what the Connecticut Preservation did with the barn restoration project. We have an 18-something built barn. We have a 1742 built house. We have not repurposed it. We are still using the barn for our animals. We have a wild Mustang and a donkey, and there's still hay in the barn, and it's great that we got the support from you guys to be on your side. We're on the website. Our property is on the website if you go under the Connecticut Barns. We were just named last year, so it was very exciting. But I live in Barkhamsted in a historic town, in the old town center. The church I go to is on the historic registry. And so it's really nice to have my property, and I just walk to church every Sunday, just like the old people did. And it's kind of neat. And we're thinking maybe retirement, we might turn it into a yoga studio or maybe a barn dance, because I like yoga.
Good idea. Settle in.
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much. That's very nice. Thank you.
Thank you, Kay.
It's 2015, and we're in Hartford, which has a poverty percentage of 39% below the poverty level. I've often said that preservation shouldn't look like me. I know that you think a lot, and you're a leader in sort of new thinking. How do we encourage a different population to be interested in historic preservation when all they think about us, we as preservationists, are only doing the gems?
Well, I mean, that's a great question, and certainly the preservation movement nationwide struggles with that. But I think that in a place like Hartford, stimulating the redevelopment using nonprofit, developers in neighborhoods and making the houses affordable is the way that you will build preservationists, because they will come into those houses, and there really is no one who doesn't like original details. Crown molding. I mean, we've all watched House Hunters. So, fireplace, exposed brick. These are the ways, Frank, that you just kind of you build a sensibility. I don't think we're building preservationists. I think we're building a consciousness and a sensibility. I like to live around places that have layers of meaning. And it's the layers of meaning that you can get in an old place. And I think that I don't care what your economic level or ethnic background, everybody appreciates that. Thanks.
Helen, we talked a little bit about preserving the mid-century moderns as something that seemed to some people as something different when they think about preserving things in Connecticut. Are we ever going to be preserving and restoring our strip malls and our big shopping centers, and because I look at those and I think they're taking over.
Well, I mean, what's the place in New Jersey with those motels? I mean, there are periods of styles that are interesting. I think that just basic, nondescript, uninteresting architecture will never really, attract people. Again, it goes back to the ugliness factor. I think of, thinking of an ugliness factor, the Stamford Town Center. Which is the most unfriendly place in the world. I mean, really would be an unpleasant thought to see that go on the National Register at some point, But, I think that probably we need to. I mean, you were talking about we're no longer looking at the special iconic place, but we still need to have standards, and I think that's really the way you go in, and that's why when we give grants or tax credits out. The base is in Connecticut that your building or site has to be on the State Register of Historic Places. So that has to have a level of significance to it. So it's not, just every place. So I don't,
One of the things that you mentioned to me that I really hadn't thought about is that, we're encouraging communities around the state to purchase open space and to preserve open space. What I hadn't thought about is that you think of open space, I think of open fields, just lots of open space. But what you don't think about, at least I don't, is that there frequently are buildings on those spaces. So now the towns have to figure out, what do we do with those?
Yeah, so this is a huge problem. It's a state problem, it's a town problem, and often with an open space purchase that a town does, they'll draw a circle around where the historic building is and say, not there. So we actually have worked with a number of towns to do conditions assessments, feasibility studies around the particular building, and particularly towns, to encourage them to look at opportunities to use the building for whatever purposes. And Ms. Sully, you have on here, is an example of that in Hamden, where actually we worked with Habitat for Humanity. Right. On that one to, that house actually went out of town hands into private hands, but other ones that stay in town hands, they can become a new community center. Every small town in Connecticut needs another place for people to meet, they truly do.
Yeah.
But we don't always, we see a lot of places that are just sort of let go. And unfortunately, the state of Connecticut has a really big problem, and they acknowledge this because, they get parks and forests and so what, that they take or they get donated, and on them are these historic houses, and they really don't have a use for them, but they're constrained by the fact that the land is state land, so you can't just open them up for single purchase. So we've been working over the years with the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection to get off the ground what's called a resident curatorship program, whereby the state would allow a curator type to, a contractor or construction person or just an advocate for doing restoration work, a craftsman, to come in and live in the house and fix it up over time, pay for materials but not pay for lodging. I mean, at the end of that, you don't own anything, but on the other hand, you've restored something wonderful. So, and that has support at DEEP.
That's an interesting
yeah.
concept. Do we have any questions that anybody would like to ask of Helen, or comments that you'd like to make? No? I'll ask one more time on that. Something that we really need to talk about, I think, has to do with money, because all of this costs money, and there's only so much that you can raise privately. Tell me a little bit about what happened with the Connecticut Trust during the state budget negotiations.
Well, she warned me. It's the only one I knew was coming. I know. I want to separate out, the Connecticut Trust is part of a coalition partnership who are supported the full funding of the Community Investment Act account. Community Investment Act was enacted 10 years ago to bring money to affordable housing projects, open space protection, various farmland projects and farmland preservation, and historic preservation. And over the years, because the revenue for this comes from recording fees in municipal, clerk's offices, and it goes directly to these agencies, over the years there have been attempts to take the money. And we have formed a very strong advocacy group to protect the integrity of this money. So come to this year's budget crisis, and the governor, in addition to zeroing out various line items, which included our maintenance and repair grants, he also zeroed out for 18 months all the proceeds from the Community Investment Act. They would now just go into the general fund to help cover the budget. And what happened at the end of the session is that the compromise has been that 50% of the recording fees will go into the general fund and 50% will stay with the particular projects that are for those 4 sectors. However, I will say that our maintenance and repair grants, which are little tiny grants that have huge impact, eliminated.
Tell me how a little tiny grant can have a huge impact, because people need to understand why that's important.
Many times, and this would go to the barns, but this also goes to a lot of churches and synagogues and sacred places. There needs to be a steeple fix. There needs to be a sill fix. There needs to be a new roof. This isn't big money. This is $30,000 projects. So our grants topped at 15, and we really only accepted applications where the total project was about $30,000. So that, in and out, in a year, do this project, and we have had such success rates with this. Steeples have been fixed. The Hooker House is getting work done on it in West Hartford, and I can't think of all that Jane is here to help me with this, but private money, it has to be cash as the match, so there's a match. And these are the places that are completely forgotten in the big budget numbers, these are the forgotten places, and that's what you're talking about. So I'm certainly an advocate for small funds that give smaller amounts out, because it does function as a catalyst for people.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned churches and other sacred places, because I think about, as a Catholic, I see how many of the churches in various neighborhoods that I've lived in have been closed down, and the diocese has determined not enough people, whatever, they close them down. So I'm aware of the fact that there are pastors of all denominations and rabbis and others who are looking at, how do I just keep this place open? So now you have maintenance, and now you're going to say, now you want to say to them, don't put up that vinyl siding. And they're thinking, this is going to save me money, because over the years, I'm not going to be paying to have this place painted every few years. So how do you strike that balance with people who are just trying to keep the building open to keep the faithful coming in?
It's something that we talk about at the Connecticut Trust all the time. And it goes back to our first real field service success, and that was with Trinity on Main in New Britain, where that pastor and that congregation really wanted to get out of that church or take that church down. And over time, working with the local advocates there, we were able to keep the church, keep the building. The church moved out, in fact, to another building, and now it's a centerpiece of downtown New Britain for arts and entertainment. But we have, that's a lot of what our staff does, is go around, sit down with the pastor, sit down with the alderman, whatever, and talk about, if you put plastic paint on this building, you will destroy it. And somebody in the room knows this here in the back. That is, or if you put vinyl windows on and take out all these other windows, you have basically destroyed. So what we're trying to do is mix, giving the right preservation advice to the churches, but also try to get them in touch with Partners for Sacred Places, which is a nationwide advocate for sacred places trying to maintain themselves. And we did this at the Church of Good Shepherd. We gave Church of Good Shepherd money to assess what they needed to do in order to have more venues, events there. But we also let them use part of the grant to hire a fundraising consultant from Partners for Sacred Places to help them develop a capital campaign. And they are doing that right now. I mean, that's, but it's very hard. We found, though, that congregations tend to like their buildings better than the pastors do. I is that not right? It's like...
Helen, our time has almost come to an end, so what I want to finish with really is I'm hoping that this program on CTN will inspire some people who are not involved in preservation right now, but who may know of a place that they spot, like the building I passed 3 times a week in their community, that they think ought to be saved. How do they start, and what should they expect along the way if they want to advocate for that place or that building, that place, that neighborhood?
Well, you start with us. I mean, call us, and unless you have a local preservation group, you call them. But certainly, that's our signature. I mean, the whole reason I believe that the Connecticut Trust has been successful is because we established what's called a circuit rider program, where the basic theory that I had, and this is 15 years ago, is preservation is all local. So we have to get out there. And that is what we exist to do, so that anybody who has an issue, and it happens every day, Aaron answers the phone, every day, 20 times a day, people calling, and then we filter it out to our circuit riders who go and visit, go right to the site, and sit down and help whoever build up, how to move forward.
Well, I just want to thank you from everyone for everything
Thank
you've done over these years. It's been really an amazing career.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you. Good.
Thank you,
Thank
Helen.
you. Wonderful. Wonderful. It's so easy. Yeah.
Thank you very much to Diane and to Helen and to all of you for being here today for this very special conversation. I also wanted to say one other thing about the history and heritage community in Connecticut this year. We've had a number of people retire. Mark Jones, our state archivist, has retired after many years of important service at the Connecticut State Library. Nick Bellantoni was here for a conversation. He's retired as state archaeologist. Helen we have here with us today, and Karen Peterson, who is at the back of the room, is retiring this year. She's the museum director for the state of Connecticut. So all of us, when I say we, I mean everybody in the state, owe a great debt to these people who do things that may not be obvious to us when we're looking around us, but what they have done is there on our landscape, and it's important, and it supports Connecticut, and the work that they have all done has contributed very much to education in Connecticut and to what makes Connecticut a special place. So I would urge you all to think thoughts of appreciation and go out today and enjoy this great state. Thank you.